Hello, this is Dr. Fran, and we're going to spend some time talking about the Gospels this week. We're going to talk about the four Gospels plus the book of Acts. We're going to spend time first with a short introduction to the Gospels. I want you to understand that there are some very specific aspects to the Gospels that you need to know about before we dig into each book. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is we want to answer, why should we even study the backgrounds behind the Gospels in the first place? Why can't we read it right at, as we look at our Bible here, why can't we read it just at face value? And that makes a lot of sense. But it's really important and really helpful when you understand the background behind what is being written. We are 2,000 years removed from when the Gospels were written, almost 2,000 years. And back then they had a different worldview of things. They saw the world very differently than what we see today. They had different lifestyles. They didn't travel much. They had different expectations of people and of even how they practiced their faith. And there was a distinct climate politically, economically, and even in the family units that we even have today. So it's important that we go back and we understand those backgrounds, and maybe we can learn from it so that we can, as we're reading the Gospels, understand what the message is that Jesus is teaching. So let's go back even further before we look at Jesus, and let's think a little bit about the days of Israel and the final days of Israel. If we go back all the way to, we start with 722 BC. We had the overtaking of the city of Jerusalem by Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar and his armies came, took Jerusalem, tore down the temple, tore down its walls, took people like the prophets, Daniel and others, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know why I couldn't remember those. And took them with him, along with many of the rich and the well-educated, out of Jerusalem, out of Canaan, and brought them to Babylon. Eventually, however, Babylon fell, and Nebuchadnezzar fell. And Cyrus of Persia now took over Babylon and therefore took over all of Judea. And soon was able to go ahead and decree that there would be a return to Jerusalem by the people of Babylon, or the Jews who were in Babylon, to go ahead and rebuild the temple and rebuild its walls. So this happened, and they rebuilt the temple, and this is where we see in the books of Ezra and Haggai and Nehemiah, they talk all about the rebuilding of the temple. In the 4th century BC, about 100 years later, Alexander the Great came on the scene from Greece, and he pushed forth Hellenization. In other words, it conquered the lands with the Greek armies. And a masterful warrior, masterful strategist and fighter, and took over basically the world. Later on, after his fall, his death, and then the splitting up of his kingdoms, they had a fight for control. And later on, there was another power that came in place, which would later eventually end up being the power of Rome, and the Romans took over. Well, the Romans were harsh, and they ruled harshly. They ruled with an iron fist, and this was the Iron Age, and they ruled with an iron fist. And there was a revolt by the Jews in the land of Canaan, and this is the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabean Revolt resulted in something called the Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah. What it was is that they had lamps that were going out, and they didn't have enough oil for the time that they had. And miraculously, they were supplied the oil to be able to keep their lamps lit as they continued to fight and resist against the Romans. And so the Jews after that had a festival, another festival, a new festival, besides the festival of Purim, which took place in response to Esther and Xerxes during their reign a few hundred years before. The Feast of Lights was a new festival which celebrated Hanukkah, which celebrated that particular miracle of supplying oil for those lamps. 162 BC to about 63 BC, You had various leaders that would reign, quasi-independent, but still vassal kings of other countries, and they were greater or lesser effectiveness. And then eventually in 63 BC, Rome dominated the landscape, took over the entire world, including this area of the world, which was Palestine, Canaan. So out of this came the Gospels. This was a setting for the Gospels. And we'll talk about Jesus' birth in a moment. We'll talk about the Gospels in a moment. But let me just kind of give you a background of what the Gospels mean. The Gospels come from the word euangelion, which means good news. That is specifically the literal meaning of that as good news. It is also called the kerygma. Kerygma is a Greek word that is used meaning to preach, to proclaim. It's good news that you are to proclaim about who? About Jesus Christ. And by the way, these are not just biographical accounts, even though we have that on the slide. It's not just biographical accounts. These are more biographic sermons. And these sermons are to tell the readers, the listeners, all about what Jesus did. They were written in Greek. They were eyewitness accounts written in Greek. And in a case of the Gospels in the Bible, we have actually 4 different accounts, 4 different versions, if you want to call that, of the same story. Now, before I cast any kind of doubt on the accuracy of each of those sermons or those Gospels, understand that they're written from different perspectives with different emphases. 3 of the Gospels line up a whole lot better than the 4th one in terms of the events. Matthew, Mark, and Luke in some areas are word for word almost the same thing in certain areas of the chapters of the books. John is quite a bit different. Now, the difference is, and we'll see that in a moment, Matthew, Mark, and Luke have some similar source material, and John came later and wrote it based on what his eyewitness account was, and was totally different in terms of what he emphasized and even the order of how he placed these different accounts of Jesus. And we'll talk about that. The biggest thing to remember is that these Gospels are Gospels that communicate the Gospel. And the Gospel is God's offer of salvation through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, I talked about the relationship between the 3 synoptic Gospels. If you look there, you'll see that Mark, Matthew, and Luke have some very similar writings here. Mark, for example, 76% of Mark is common to Luke and Matthew, and 45 and 41% of Matthew and of Luke are common to one another. You'll see that there's some common things. However, understand that there's also some uniqueness. 20% is unique to Matthew, 35% unique to Luke, 3% is unique to Mark. But Mark and Matthew probably share the most in common of anything. And so you'll see that in these charts to show, hey, you know what? There is a relationship between these 3 Gospels. Why? A lot of it had to do with oral tradition, that they were closer to the oral tradition and they had the exact same phrasing. Another could be that they shared a common written analysis or written gospel, some call it Q, that have a uniqueness in its phrasing that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all take little bits and pieces from to help jog their memory or to help continue those traditions. It doesn't make it any less inspired. Hear that. What it does make it is that they are being smart about how they take the eyewitness accounts and incorporate that into the story that they are telling to tell the good news of Jesus Christ to the hearers. So you see a little bit of relationship there with the Synoptic Gospels. The big thing, though, is to remember that the Gospels and the Gospel are 2 different things. The Gospels are the 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we look at what the type of literature, and we ask what the story is about as we're going through it, and the storyline. We also ask the question, how do these 4 relate? John is different than the other 3. They all tell the story of Jesus, but they tell different stories in some cases, or they tell them a little different way of how they remember them. It doesn't mean they're any less inspired. What it does mean is that they are telling their viewpoint, their perspective on what Jesus said and what Jesus did. There are some very big distinctives, and the reason why for these different viewpoints is Matthew, for example, has a viewpoint of trying to tell it to the Jews. So he's going to emphasize a more Jewish nature of things. And you'll see this as we look at each individual gospel. They have their emphases, and therefore it comes out in their stories to look a little bit different. The difference between the Gospels and the Gospel, as I said, is the Gospel itself is the message, whereas the Gospels are the 4 books, capital G. The Gospel, little g, is the message of the life, ministry, the death, the resurrection, and of course, the significance of Jesus Christ. Why did they even write this? Why did they even write the 4 Gospels? I already mentioned that it's an extended biographical sermons to proclaim the good news of Jesus' death and to call people to faith. John chapter 20 says that these are written, verse 31, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Those Gospels were needed because it became hard to distribute the message quickly. They would retell the stories word for word, and they could do that in that culture. They were really good at memorizing large amounts and retelling large amounts of information to one another and passing it on. And it was reliably spoken, transmitted by word alone. But they could not do this on a widespread basis quickly. And as the apostles were dying off, they needed something in writing so that people will be able to continue to tell the story and to instruct new believers in the teachings of Jesus Christ. So the Gospels were needed and necessary. And so they used eyewitness, they used reliable compositions of documents. Luke chapter 1 tells us that he compiled a narrative of things that have been accomplished from the eyewitnesses and the word delivered to us. In other words, he has taken us from written and verbal discussions. And Luke was a scholar. He was a doctor and was able to transmit that in writing. By the way, Luke is the longest gospel in terms of size on a scroll than any of them. And Luke did a thorough job of researching everything that was said about Jesus Christ that's in his gospel. So they use a criteria that the gospel process that they had. They had original eyewitnesses were still around, so they would pen these things out, and the eyewitnesses the original eyewitnesses could have easily said, "Oh no, that didn't happen," but they didn't. They embraced and agreed with it and said, "Yes, this truly happened." In fact, 3 of the 4 of the Gospels were directly attributed to apostles, and I would actually say all 4 were. Matthew and John were apostles. Mark was directly attributed to Peter, and Luke, of course, got his information from a variety of eyewitnesses, including some of the apostles. Either way, God was in control as they put this together to share the good news. So understand that each gospel is individual. They have their own uniqueness. They're written by an individual author, and they have a different author's perspective. So they're going to feel a little different than one another. But our goal is, as we exegete the passage, as we decipher what's happening, we're trying to get at the author's intent. And so understand that the author wrote with an agenda to try to reach people. They didn't just write a biography. They wrote some way to reach people. So, as a result, I know this is a long list here. Matthew, who may have used Mark as a source as well as another source for his written. He may have written it in Hebrew, but Matthew had an emphasis to be an Old Testament heavy. He quoted Old Testament a lot. He focused how Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament prophecy because he was trying to communicate the information to a Jewish audience. Mark, written through Peter's testimony, through Peter's accounts, and Mark was probably the scribe, he focused most of his material on the 7 days surrounding Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, Passion Week, the week before. So most of his material was written during that week. Luke, he was not an eyewitness, but he used eyewitnesses as sources and probably apostles. And he was, by the way, the only non-Jewish writer, and because of that, he wrote to a non-Jewish community and communicated the importance of women as well as the importance of healing in his gospel. John was the last gospel written. He was an eyewitness. He wrote it, believe it or not, in the mid-90s. So he was an older man when he wrote this. But he wrote this as an evangelistic, focusing on the deity of Jesus and focused on the gospel for people to receive first and foremost. And you see that in John chapter 3 verse 16, as well as what I read before, John chapter 20, talking about by believing you may have life in his name. So a couple more things as we get ready to finish out. Jesus, as we think about Jesus, remember that his life, this isn't a biography of Jesus. This is a biographical sermon of Jesus, each of the Gospels. But we need to know that Jesus was a real, actual person. And so after the reign of Herod began, around BC 3-ish, 4-ish, Jesus was born, and he began his public ministry around AD 26 or 27. He was about 30 years old. Other ministries that he had, this Galilean ministry around the Sea of Galilee, then outside, and then finally to Jerusalem where he was crucified, happened around AD 30. So we're coming up on 2,000 years of Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection. We are 2,000 years ago, Jesus walked on this earth. Jesus taught on 4 main topics, many other things, but 4 main topics: God, or the kingdom of God, and how Jesus related to that. He also spoke about how he was unique, how he was God, how he and the Father were one, and that he was to do the Father's will. He talked about human life and how sinful humans are, and what he was to do for help people overcome their death and to have life, and have life in his name. And then he also, in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 and other places, he talked about his second coming and what would happen when he were to come again. So that gives you kind of an overview of the Gospels. Hopefully that's been helpful to you. We're going to spend more time on each individual book. I'll try to go through each book in about 10 or 15 minutes each. So feel free to go ahead and watch one and walk away, think about it, and then watch some more, and hopefully you'll be able to really gain some knowledge from that. Thank you. God bless you. Bye-bye.